So I think we're ready to get going. I can see the BSL interpreters are back ready. We're nearly done. The marathon day is getting towards its conclusion. The downside is you've got to spend more time with me again, I'm afraid. So we're back to me. So we've got now roughly an hour and a quarter. I think we're going to finish earlier than that. So I hope you still think it's good value for money if we let you go a little bit early. What we're going to talk to you now about is recommendations and also where do we see the corpus going next. Please do still use Slido. There's still time to ask questions, and please do kind of move around the room as it makes you feel comfortable. Okay, so our website is now live. It has been live for a while, and one of the things we've been building over the last 3 years or so is EDICa, Equity in Research Innovation Careers. This is an interactive tool that anybody can go onto to access free to use resources on evidence-based interventions and solutions to creating equity in the research innovation ecosystem. So I've just taken a screenshot here because it's easier, I think, than taking you to the website and showing you everything. But if you look on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see you can search by topics and hashtags as well. This is not complete yet. So when we picked the date, the 20th of November, it was because we thought EDICa would be finishing in the next few weeks. EDICa is not finishing in the next few weeks. We've got another few months left to go. So there's still time for you to send us feedback on what you'd like EDICa to look like, and there's still time for you to send us resources. This will be a live web-based tool. It's not just EDICa resources on here either. So it's not just materials being produced by us and our flexible fund holders. It's anything that you see that has a strong evidence base you think will be useful for the community to know about. So please do get in touch, send us feedback, send us resources you think we can point to. The key thing is this, remembering that we take an evidence-based approach to EDI. Now, you'll be pleased to know that you've only got me for a few minutes before I then pass over to Robert and James again. But we were asked to conclude this afternoon with some provocations for the audience. What would we want you to take away from today? And obviously, I think you've heard a lot today and you've contributed a lot. I've not had a chance to look at all the post-it notes yet, but we will be taking photos of all of this. And I'd like to thank you all for your contributions today. So I am going to try and go slightly controversial if I can. Probably not as controversial as I'm capable of going, but pushing in terms of going back to what I said this morning, that we can't just keep reinforcing the status quo. We can't have interventions that change how organizations look. We can't focus on making organizations look better, because that doesn't necessarily mean things are better. So Sarah Ahmed has spoken about this at length in terms of the whiteness of organizations. But this would apply to a range of areas of oppression that we've identified across the research innovation ecosystem. So Workstream 1, as a reminder, was looking at menstrual health in the workplace, but it's an example of what happens if we recognize that researchers are embodied. And we look at the experiences of people whose bodies don't fit the working environment that were designed by and for people who don't live with those life experiences. When I get asked, what should we do to make any workplace or any employment system equitable, one of my answers, which is only slightly facetious, is we need to burn it all down and start again. We can't do that. But we have to be very careful that what we do doesn't just reinforce the very inequalities that we're trying to challenge, because we can end up inadvertently becoming part of the problem. Over lunch, we were talking about things like Athena Swan, disability confident. We need to take a critical lens to the EDI work that we're doing and make sure that what we're doing isn't just about helping organizations badge themselves as inclusive while they actually maintain exclusion, they have exclusionary practices. If we could rebuild the RNA sector based on what we've learned, what would we do? So I'm just going to revisit what I said earlier about menstrual health. but really kind of go back to saying, if we centered the social model of disability and not just a disability, if we centered that kind of social model that oppression is caused by our environments, we can then see that even quote unquote, and I put normal in bracket in speech marks because we don't actually know what a normal period is. There's been so little research on menstruation. We don't know what a normal period is. Women have only been having regular periods for about 100 years, if that, because women just used to be pregnant all the time and then they died. We don't know what having menopause in the workplace looks like because this is the first cohort of women to really go through that experience. So we don't know what normal menstruation looks like. But even if we said we do, that person isn't disabled by their menstruation. They may be disabled by environments that are designed for people who do not menstruate. We talked earlier about employers stepping in to fill gaps, and Robert mentioned that as well, that we're seeing increasing pressure on systems like healthcare, also increasing pressure on access to assessments and diagnosis for ADHD and autism for adults, particularly for women. And employers are coming in to fill in that gap. So we're seeing employers now offering egg freezing for people, employers having wider and wider roles in people's lives and in their health. That is positioned often as a good thing. I'm not convinced it is a good thing because I'm of the view that it's not actually when people do this, what they're doing is a bit like Google has like pool tables and stuff and bars at work. It's so you don't leave, right? It's not because they want you to be really happy. It's because so you don't leave. The reason employers help you freeze your eggs is so you don't take time off at a critical stage for them. Do we want employers helping people manage their periods? Do we want employers telling women to download period tracking apps? And I always say to people, don't use a period tracking app because you don't know how that data is going to be used. And what we see happening in the States, for example, I suspect that data is going to be used to persecute women who are perceived to have had a miscarriage or an abortion. So I have real worries about the roles of employers stepping in to fill the healthcare gap. That's not to say all employers are badly motivated, but often the advice isn't evidence-based and the advice is motivated to keep you in the workplace and as productive as you can be. And we also need to understand, and this is where I think qualitative research is really helpful in understanding that when we want to do a workplace intervention, by wanting to do the intervention, that's the point where you start the intervention. As Robert said, it's not when you press the button on go and the intervention starts. Actually, when you start doing training for senior management on why they need this intervention, you're starting to change the way they view things by asking people how they manage their periods or how they manage their health. You're asking them to reflect on what they do, and it starts to change behaviours. And what can we do differently? I would argue we need a multi-stakeholder approach. Employers are part of a wider ecosystem, funders are part of a wider ecosystem, trade unions are part of that ecosystem. The healthcare system is part of that ecosystem. So we need a multi-stakeholder perspective when we're looking at how we enable people to thrive in the workplace. And although Workstream 1 has focused on menstruation, I think you've all been given some EDICa branded period products to take away and show people. You've got, whether you worked out or not, your stress ball is a period blob. So you've all got a period blob to take home with you. It's an example of how we make the body visible in the research work that people do. It's not the only example, but it happens to be an example where there's about to be legislation coming in to increase the pressure on employers to do a little bit better. Bear in mind, they just have to have menopause action plans. They don't have to do an awful lot with those plans, but it's a starting point. And I always like to do research about things nobody wants to talk about. And one issue that hasn't really, it comes up a little bit through our research, but one thing we don't hear a big discussion about is continence in the workplace. And more people are living with urinary and fecal continence challenges. It's just not something that we talk about, but we do through the DICE project I mentioned earlier. We're designing a comic at the moment, which will be looking at the challenges faced by somebody who's managing fecal incontinence in the workplace, because it's out there, it affects people, but it's just not spoken about. Even when people talk about menstruation, they still don't talk about the messy bits. They talk about the hot flushes and the cognitive stuff, but they don't really talk about the blood that people are managing in the workplace. I will now hand over to Robert.
Thank you. Like Kate, it's been for me, it's been a great day's conversation. It's been lovely to see people in person engaged in really important conversations, I think. And just before I come to the content of the slide, I'm going to abuse the opportunity of having a rant because it's a space that I feel is quite important. So I said this morning, there's a lot asked of universities. So just as Kate was speaking, I've written down 9 things that have come across my desk in the last 3 weeks, each of which are reasonably chunky administrative responsibilities, lots of which are well-intentioned. Because I've got a bad memory, I've written them down. So one was Athena Swan, and nobody's going to dispute that that's well-intended, but it's paperwork and data and labour-intensive work. Race Equality Charter, DORA compliance, COARA signatories, HR excellence in research, where we had a concordant revisit 2 weeks ago. REF, I spent the last 4 days trying to wrestle a code of practice to the ground when they still haven't told us what they actually want it to look like. NSS, which was a kind of legacy thing. PTES, which is the postgraduate equivalent of that. I don't work in England any longer, so I don't have to deal with KEF, but if you did, you might have to. But we had our TQER visitation, one of the first institutions in Scotland to undergo the joyful experience of TQER, which is like the OFS, but gentler. But they still parachute through the windows, expect to speak to all of your students and all of your staff. And something like a 150-page document went to them and thousands of pieces of evidence. So in and amongst all of that, as you're trying to just run the business of being in business, you're trying to address how you do so inclusively and do so well and with the best of intentions. And for me, the provocation I would give you from Workstream 2 is the provocation which I started this morning with. I don't think that somebody's going to come over the hill in some kind of savior-like mode and say, here's some extra money and some extra resource to do all the things that you're really struggling to do. It's going to have to be a combination of lobbying for resource and attention and delivering change on the ground at the level of individual choices each day and each way that you choose to enact the thing that you're being asked to enact. We're very lucky in EDICa to have a funder consortium that involves a range of people, and there are some of our funder consortium in the room and some non-funders in the room who fund research elsewhere. So we can ask a lot of funders, but I would guess that they would say, similar to I've just said, I've got a gazillion things that are on my to-do list and a limited budget, and so I don't have the easy answer to that. So we should simultaneously ask those funders to do particular things, and I've got suggestions for what some of those might be. But as individual members of the research and innovation community, I think we can take some responsibility for doing things differently ourselves. There's nothing to stop you when you're being asked to review on an unpaid basis bids from some call or other or some funder or other to engage slightly more publicly than they might be comfortable with. And how did that go for me? What did good look like? What advice would I give to somebody bidding for that? And that takes me to, I guess, the heart of the insight from Workstream 2 for me is that what I would describe as the traditional view of EDI is hugely important. So the protected characteristics that many of our flexible fund conversations before lunch were about, hugely important, create huge barriers to progress and inclusion in careers. But in the higher education sector in particular, there's an additional set of criteria to do with institutional setting, which just don't get talked about. And if you work in a less research-intensive environment, your opportunity to succeed is hugely inhibited in a hermetically sealed, systemically loaded set of dice, where you'll never get access to the opportunity to understand what good looks like. Funders have a responsibility to try and address that, but as individual activist members of the research and innovation community, we have a responsibility to try and share that knowledge. So that could be as simple as doing a debrief. It could be as simple for a funder as thinking about underrepresented communities in the commissioning process in the way that Chris talked about with the Lucia programme, which we helped support. And I thought that was a really good example of trying to say, these are the kinds of people that we're trying to engage in the commissioning process and encourage to bid. But it has to go from the commissioning through to the evaluation, through to the implementation. And we have a voice in that process. So my provocation from this morning stands, which is, what can you personally commit to do that would make a difference to at least one other scholar from an underrepresented community to try and give them the insights that they need, to give them the opportunities that they don't currently have to succeed. And if you could rebuild the research and innovation ecosystem, would you burn it down and start again? Well, that's a very attractive, if somewhat disruptive thing to do. And there's I'd have a whole set of other health and safety things I'd have to do before burning it down, to check that you knew the evacuation routes, that we had an insurance policy, and so on and so on. But for me, it's about, there's some pretty obvious good practice guidance that is coming out from the EDICa caucus, as well as lots of other sources. And it's about trying to encourage funders and organisations to enact that good practice, whilst adopting this other individual responsibility mentality for me. And I have spent my life as a researcher. I started out in engineering, but ran away to the social sciences, which leaves me as a somewhat stateless citizen, in that my engineering colleagues, like Steve McLaughlin, would happily tell me every day that I worked at Heriot-Watt, I wasn't a proper engineer. And my social science colleagues kind of look at you slightly strange, like, you're still an engineer, right? But I've spent most of my life in social sciences doing research on strategy formulation and execution in leadership teams in public, private, and charitable organisations. And that is a very sacred space to try and get into. It's a high trust environment. You're asking to sit in on and ask opinions as to why did you choose to not do this or to do that, to divest from this, to hire those people, to not do that, to merge with this organisation, to launch that kind of a service. So it's a really difficult space in which to do data gathering. And I've spent about 30 years trying to do data gathering in that space. It's nowhere near as difficult as trying to get access to data about how did you arrive at which project to fund. Like, nowhere near as difficult. And the Workstream 2 colleagues have been working with funders who funded us to do this research and finding it really difficult to get access to the data that really would matter. So if I could do one thing differently, it would be to ask funders, in part of commissioning sometimes unpaid review work, to make a mandatory upfront expectation that in parallel with that, you'll participate in some reflection on how did that go from your perspective. On the outside looking in, all of the guidance that we and others have worked brilliantly to try and develop is well-intentioned, but is somewhat overwhelming data about what you're supposed to do, what you're supposed to think about, what kind of concerns you should try and make explicit, not implicit. And then you go into a complicated meeting in a time-pressured environment with less money than you'd like, and you've got 100 applications and you can only fund 3, and you're supposed to do that. And the lived experience inside those spaces is incredibly difficult to get access to. But I think we could mandate more reflective and more reflexive practice on the part of the people who do the commissioning, the administration, the chairing of the panels, the panel membership, and the reviewing, to get better lessons so that we can share better insights to the people who are not yet succeeding in bidding. And they're not yet succeeding in bidding because they have no foggiest idea. So if you want my clothing equivalent of the disruptive burn it all down, it really grinds my gears. The REF panel membership is the ultimate peer review assessment in the UK ecosystem, giving away roughly £1 billion a month of public money through, in Scotland it's called REG, and so in that process, in order to be more inclusive, which is what they said, what Research England said was they wanted to be more representative and more inclusive of a diverse range of voices in the evaluation process. They said that publicly. And so as a change from every previous REE and REF, at REF 29, you were allowed to self-nominate if you wanted to be involved in a panel. That sounds brilliant, doesn't it? Takes away a barrier, because they used to ask the great and the good and the learned societies. And yet, there are 144 member universities of UUK, 33 of which have got no representation at all in any capacity, in any panel, in any subject area for REF 2029. And yet one university, University of Manchester, which I'm sure is a lovely university, has got 29 members of staff involved in the REF process. And unless we break out of that cycle of providing the opportunity to be on the inside of conversations, even if it's only in an observer capacity, in order to feed back into a community that's starved of information of what 4-star actually looks like in REF terms, or what a winning bid looks like in funding terms, it will never break out of this cycle. And some of that has to come from us coming from the bottom up, and some of it has to come from us being disruptive and engaging in advocacy around that and calling out disadvantage when we see it. And I would call out that as a very significant disadvantage to 33 universities across the UK, who on every other measure are definitely not as research intensive as University of Manchester, but are populated by people who are really trying to do great research, who've got reach into communities of practice and lived experience that those other more elite universities probably don't have, and who are currently hermetically sealed away from the process. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Okay, so I spoke quite at length, I think, earlier this morning about some of the things that I'm about to go through again, so I won't, I promise, labour the point this time round, and I'm very much supportive of Kate's idea that we try and finish, perhaps not prematurely, but if we can finish early, then all the better in one particular sense. So I'm just going to largely go through the slide that's in front of you, and there are no spoilers here, as I say, in one sense, because I kind of showed my hand. I have no poker face or anything like that in terms of what I think is really fundamental to making some meaningful change to EDI across the research and innovation ecosystems. And so effectively my opening gambit really in terms of the provocation, very similar to what Kate was kind of touching on before. So again, no real need to go into any depth because it's almost synonymous really in one sense, the nature of what the provocation here is about. Organisations work with key stakeholders to enact meaningful changes to the organisation of work. Meaningful being the main operative word here. This is about how do you as an organisation draw on the people or the institutions or different groups or different stakeholders who are either directly connected to your organisation, your employees, the unions that you recognise, the learning societies, etc., or it may well be organisations that are could be connected in partnerships with such organisations. Civil society organisations are probably one example of that as well. So the stakeholder approach, I'm sure organisations like universities would probably claim in one sense rhetorically, not for the first time, that they are this kind of organisation already, and I think the evidence strongly points in quite a different direction. That's not to say that some of these practices don't exist in many of the organisations that we've done our research with or the organisations that you have experience of as well. So in one sense, just to kind of go over what I was kind of saying earlier today, it sounds kind of paradoxical in a way. I think in order for us to go forward with EDI, I think we need to get in a time machine and go back 3 or 4 decades and rediscover some of the kind of things that have been lost generally throughout all industries, not necessarily research and innovation. That's not what I'm not arguing is for. Let's go back to the 70s and 80s because they were fantastic. Everybody had space hoppers and drove around in cars like in Life on Mars and stuff like that and were sexist and stuff. Clearly giving it a contemporary edge and bringing in EDI into these processes. And they should be fundamental. If you just take the example of the role a union can play in EDI, we all aware of, at least to some extent, certainly working in universities, about the role of unions in setting terms and conditions of employment, pay, pensions, etc. But they need to be drawn in terms of EDI. And my union, University College Union, has been trying to do this now for quite some time and has made some almost like fierce opposition from the employers you see here in particular about simple things in one sense, about things like precarious contracts of employment, which tend to be disadvantaged people from particular historically disadvantaged groups. And if we look at gender pay gaps and other pay gaps related to disability and ethnicity, we see some of the things as well. So my provocation point really is this is all about power, this is about politics, and I think EDI is not a nice subject. It is quite a messy subject. And people who really want to kind of make a difference are going to have to get their hands dirty. I go back to the point about the idea of the troublemaker. I don't think that's the right term, but when you say it, you know exactly what it means. We need more troublemakers, and we need organisations, more importantly, to take those troublemakers a lot more seriously than they currently do. So just some kind of general key learnings, etc., like that. It's, again, these are the kind of things that kind of make up this scenario. I think there is an almost like a sectoral denial of the failings of such institutions to deal with EDI. Robert, you read off a list of different, different kind of bodies and programs, initiatives, and yes, they all have merits and they all kind of command and have had some effect. But when you think about the amount of effort and the bureaucracy, and a lot of that tends to be kind of gendered, etc., and things like that, realistically, they end up more often than not recreating the very problems that they're meant to solve. So I'm not saying get rid of those, but if we do them, they need to be done in some meaningful way. And the people who actually have to sit that report that says you need to do X, Y, and Z, they need to be doing X, Y, and Z, and perhaps more important on top of that, they need to be held accountable if that doesn't happen. And again, some of the things that kind of just creeps through all of the research that we've been doing in one sense here at EDICa is that many of the kind of approaches, again, things that have been mentioned already more than once, they don't deliver. And I think one of the reasons for that is, in one sense, they're really evidence-based. The ideas, well-intentioned, don't get me wrong, but they really kind of co-design, and again, a fundamental pillar on of EDICa. So just a couple of quick points. Again, just going over all ground in one sense. So we need organisations to work more closely with people and organisations, attempting to improve conditions. And I think EDI shouldn't be a thing in itself, but clearly, in some instances, it needs to be to a point. Generally, the things that are probably like to send us off in the right direction and hopefully be the basis of some kind of momentum, because I think everybody would agree to or think it would be a good idea to improve job satisfaction and improve the working environment. These are enablers for everybody. Everybody's a winner. And then if we, at the end of that situation, with a range of kind of inequalities, then that's what we should be making our priorities. So in one sense, I'll just kind of quickly sum up that in one sense, in this room, we've got an abundance of people in here who are the architects, if you like, of great ideas, great practices, great strategies, etc., and things like that. Unfortunately, maybe one or two exceptions, etc., things like that. I'm not aware that we've got people in here who hold the levers of power, the ones that can kind of put a lot of these things and make sure that they happen and stand by those decisions, etc., and things like that. That's the people that we really need to speak to. And I think the challenge clearly of the EDI caucus and everybody else in this room is, how do we get to that next stage? Being a troublemaker is definitely part of that, but a lot of it's just doing really good research and trying to hold people account to it. And I think if we can resolve that, then we'll start to resolve the problems. But I think we're still a little bit away from doing that sort of thing. So I'll finish there and hand you back to Kate.
Right, thank you very much. So I think we're now moving. Have we got questions on Slido? One question.
Can we go home?
How rude.
No, I was assuming the
Yes,
question.
we know.
I wasn't saying that.
We got any questions? Have we stunned people into silence? Can we stop sharing? Okay. A question for Robert. You're the only one to get a question, Robert.
Do I need that microphone or was this one?
I think it should be okay.
On the screen.
So the question was that I focused on this, the importance of having access to knowing what good looks like, but should we also challenge what good looks like? I don't disagree with that. I would draw to that a particular focus, which is methodological and disciplinary. And you come, it's okay. In some disciplines, so I started out in engineering and science disciplines and medicine, there's a fairly accepted view of what is the kind of norm for methodological choices that you make. And therefore the peer review process tends not to pay that much attention to it beyond some kind of hygiene test that, yes, this is a big enough sample, or yes, that's a reasonable control to have put in place. And in the humanities, arts, social sciences space, it's a much more contested space. And the evidence base in the area that I know best, which is business management studies, is that when you have a diverse pool of eminent reviewers who come from different methodological traditions, they don't agree on what good looks like. And therefore proposals get self-eviscerated and therefore don't get funded. And I would draw attention to the Ref 2021, which is now a bit historic, but that's the most recent census point that compares every discipline across the piece. And management studies ranked 30th out of 34 when measured by pounds per person per year of research monies gathered. And I think it's that methodological, what good looks like, that's driving that. And with no disrespect to whichever belief system or no belief system you subscribe to, it really, really irritates me that theology got 70% more money per person per year in the Ref cycle than management studies. And if I was sitting in Lord Valence's shoes, looking at the mission-led challenges of the Westminster government, one of which is around the systemic productivity gap, I'm not sure I'd place my chips on the roulette table on the God square or goddess square rather than on the business and organisation and economic square. But that's what the outcome is of that difference of opinion as to what good looks like. So I think good should look like fair and equitable opportunity to succeed. It should look like a support process which tries to draw people in and nurture them and give them the opportunity early in their career to have those insights. I think that the flexible fund model that we've used is a great way of trying to give people the opportunity to experience bidding for money and leading money in a PI role early. I thought Kate James and I oversaw rounds 1, 2 and 3 of that process. And we noticed in round 1 that what happened was the best written proposals were from experienced researchers. And we deliberately put a steer into rounds 2 and 3 to say, quite happy for you to be involved, but we'd prefer it to be led by someone who's not an experienced peer. And that made a difference. So I think back to this, from the bottom up, what can you personally do to change that? You can encourage those kinds of different forms of good that have consequences for individual careers, which eventually sum up to having consequences for the sector.
Brilliant, thanks, Robert. So we have a question from Nikki about disseminating EDICa. I'm going to get onto that when I do my conclusion, so I won't answer that one now. A question for James. Pushing organisations to be more radical is good, but how do we navigate legitimate pushback, like lack of funding or risks of legal implications, I suspect, or remove government funding from organisations? So how do we be radical in a space where there's such threats to organisations?
Okay, seeing that this is a provocation part of the agenda, then I think it's fair to be provocative, at least to a certain extent, in a response like that. What I mean is that the term radical, I think it's not fair in one sense to think of this as radical in one sense, because not that long ago, what is now potentially seen as radical was perfectly normal. And if anything, 30, 40 years ago, the way that we are now was almost unknown. You know, the idea of organisations largely being unitarist and typically top-down concentrated, lack of real meaningful pluralist structures in the organisations. So I beg to kind of differ on that particular point. But to broaden it out in a contemporary sense, the very things that I'm kind of suggesting, and Kate's touched on to a certain extent as well, is that this is common practice in very large parts of Europe. You know, the UK in one sense is a bit of an outlier in terms of how it operates in terms of its industrial relations systems. Trade union membership in all countries has probably declined in the last 30, 40 years. It's substantially declined in the UK, but what's probably changed most radically is the decline of collective bargaining. You know, the idea that the issues that affect employees and also employers as well. Employers are interested in productivity. Employees are interested in their interests, which largely around pay, working conditions, and obviously equalities. In the vast majority of UK, in the UK, collective bargaining is around about 20% for all organisations. In some parts of Europe, it's 70, 80, 90%. And it's perfectly normal and legitimate to think that employees, representatives get together and try to figure out problems between them in order to move forward. And there's absolutely no reason why EDI can't be absolutely dead centre to that. So I'm talking around the question, of course. And the only way in which that I can probably add to that, because it could go a long way in it, is that we've got the Employment Rights Bill that's may well be assisting that particular process. But no, I don't think I've got any easy solutions. I think what I'm proposing or what I'm thinking about really is a long journey. It's been a long journey to get to where we are. We have to think about a long journey to kind of get back to some extent where we were before. But clearly, whatever we used in the 70s and 80s would no longer be fit for purpose going into the almost like the third decade of the 21st century. So clearly, these things need to be updated and etc. and things like that. So,
okay, brilliant. So I'm going to answer the next two questions, as no one specifically asked me a question, but I'm going to, and then I think we'll go on to the concluding slides to try and keep to my promise and people go a little bit early. So a possibly flippant propagation, do we need a new term for EDI? Have you seen any evidence of this work being more palatable under a different name? And what I was thinking over lunch is, did I come up with the right provocation for this afternoon? And I'm not sure I did. And if I were to come up with another one, it's we've got to stop depoliticizing EDI. So it's become really depoliticized. It's become linked to performance and productivity. And it's become something you can spend a lot of money getting a badge to tell everybody how good you are at EDI. And actually, EDI is deeply political. Race equality is deeply political. Disability inclusion is deeply political. The social model of disability is at its core a political movement for the emancipation of disabled people. Whether we get any more traction, I mean, one of the things that James and I have noticed is we get a lot more traction from employers if we talk about neurodiversity than if we talk about disability. And it's because employers think there's a business case for employing neurodivergent people. And you kind of have to make a decision, do I go along with that to get access into that organisation in the hope that can affect some change? But while I'm doing that, am I doing that in a way that depoliticizes the neurodiversity movement because it's linked to a business case? It's not that long since we had business cases for why you should employ women, and I always found that pretty offensive. So I suppose I would push back on that a little bit and say, even if it does work in the short term, it might in the long term reinforce the depoliticization of these kinds of discussions. So yeah, we've seen, like I say, instead of talking about disability, we talk about neurodiversity. James and I chaired a kind of industry-focused conference a couple of years ago where lots of neurodivergent people saying, don't call me disabled, I'm not disabled. That's really stigmatizing to be disabled. And as a disabled person, I find it really offensive when people say, don't call me disabled. It's a really bad thing to be disabled. I'm disabled by my environment. It's not a property of me. And when you start to see that the oppression you're facing is caused by external forces, that politicizes it, but it also empowers you to know that you're not the problem. And when I'm teaching EDI, one of the things I say to students is, I'm going to give you a language to explain the oppression that you face. And I think that's really powerful. So no, we shouldn't call it something else. Maybe EDI is not the right term. I would say equity rather than equality, for example. I would talk about oppression rather than marginalization. But if we start calling it, I don't know, the business case for, we're actually feeding into the underlying narrative. There's something fundamentally the problem with people who are marginalized and oppressed. Which then takes me on to, are those in power really the ones we want to engage with next? They're good at saying things, I have noticed. But does change lie more in numbers, e.g. middle management? Senior people appoint people like them into middle management, right? So it's called homosocial reproduction. So we run the risk of people go into those roles feminists go into senior roles in the hope of changing things from within. But the truth is you probably can't survive in those roles if you're trying to be a political activist. Now, it's not to say you shouldn't take on those roles. It's not to say you can't affect some kind of change. But when I was sitting here just now looking at this room, I was wondering, are you the people we should be talking to? And yes, because in a way you feel less alone, you're learning different ways to go around things, but are you the ones who are the problem? And quite probably you're not, because you're here. So I think a lot of this has to lie in the Employment Relations Bill could be a lot tougher. And just because it's not doesn't mean we can't push for subsequent legal frameworks that would have more oomph behind them, for want of a better way of putting it. So yes, I think we do need to deal with those senior people. They need to, we had a discussion earlier on about, so I say this with no offense to anybody in the room, but quite often you get to be very senior because you can make a conversation about yourself. So you can use any kind of conversation to push for the agenda that you want to. And that's not a criticism, that's how you survive in the system. So you have to make this about them and what they will benefit. And that's the same for any kind of organisational change, I think. So I said I was going to be a bit more controversial. And again, there's no desire to be offensive to anybody in the room, and I'm fairly senior myself. So we all have to kind of accept that you get to be senior because you do what the organisation wants you to do. You're that ideal researcher from this morning. So you have to kind of have some critical self-awareness. So there's some other questions coming up. So what I did earlier for Christopher Smith was I took screenshots of the questions. So if we can do that, and we can maybe answer some of them in a blog post afterwards. I'm going to go back to my slides. I might need some technical support on how to do that, which is a bit embarrassing at my that's not right. That's his activity. That's not right. So I'm just going to start talking, and hopefully somebody will correct me. Here we go. So what's next? So I'm going to try and get through this fairly quickly because people are starting to leave, and I want to say my thank yous while most people are still here. So I'm really delighted to say that, as I said earlier, we'll be going on until the end of next year. So you can't get rid of us just yet. We're hanging around for quite a bit longer, and hopefully longer than that. And one of the next things we're going to do next year, and I was trying to think of Toy Story here, R&I and beyond. So we're going to be working with stakeholders like the UK government in terms of helping them frame guidance for employers on how to meet their new responsibilities under the Employment Rights Bill. We're working with employers outside of research and innovation who, in my experience, are a lot more receptive to these kind of conversations than perhaps universities are. So that's what we're going to do in the next 12 months. If you've got any organisations you think would like to work with us, please put them in touch, because we're very happy to come and do some training or some workshops like this and roadshow, not just the VR, but the other work that we're doing. And because we're academics and because people are precariously employed, we're looking for more funding as well. So that's kind of what we're going to be doing over the next 6 to 12 months. But one thing we're doing, and I'm not going to make everybody look at Beth, but Beth is sitting over there, and what she's been doing is developing an app for line managers on how to be more disability inclusive and how to be more inclusive of neurodivergent people in the workplace. This is taking EDICa's findings and translating them into the engineering and sciences sector, so outside the research innovation ecosystem. So this little screenshot of it, Beth did an amazing job. We've done a lot of synchronous in-person training, but we can't keep doing it. So how do we roll it out? And one way to roll it out is to have interactive asynchronous training. And because it's an app, people can do it if they're peripatetic workers, they can access it at times that work for them. So this is evidence-based training for line managers on how to improve their confidence in supporting neurodivergent and disabled people. I'm nearly done. So what are my key provocations to conclude? The way we must be evidence-based, we have to be evidence-based. We can't keep rolling out training and interventions that might actually be actively harmful for people. They have to be co-designed and they must be about transformation. So the changes that we make, they can't just kind of nibble away and make organizations look like they're doing better while they leave harmful structures and practices and norms in place. So that's me finished. I want to say thank you very much to everybody. And I've written a list of people to say thank you to. And I'm really worried, having done this, I'm going to forget people. So if you don't hear your name and you want to be thanked, like wave your hand at me or something like that. So I want to thank all the delegates, all of our panelists in person and online, and our interpreters, all of our speakers, every Flexible Fund applicant and reviewer. I want to thank Joss, Kiara, Siddhartha, Dong, Steffi, and Kat. So Kat was working on the caucus for the first kind of year or so. I want to thank Ashmika. Where's Ashmika? There's Ashmika, and Oscar and Beth, all of our co-investigators, all of the workstream leads, Fenella and Lizzie, who we would not be here without today. So Lizzie and Fenella were here last night getting the room together. They were here before me this morning, and I got here pretty early this morning, getting everything together for everybody. They have looked after you all incredibly well, and I'd like to thank the catering team and Freddie as well. Thank you very much. You can all go home.